Well, howdy, Pastor Mark Driscoll here with the weekly Ask Pastor Mark newsletter. This week's question comes from Michael. If you've got a question, send it in to hello@markdriscoll.org, and maybe I'll answer it for you. This one comes from Michael. He says, hope all is well with you and your family. It is. Thank you very much. We just got back from a great break. Right to the point, there is a tension in the subject of children's church. I hear tons of pros and cons on both sides. He said recently within our church is this debate. On one side says that children's church is wrong. I'll furrow my brow and point my finger. It's wrong. And that since church as a whole is for worshiping the living God and that Jesus is present where two or more are gathered, just so you know, two or more is not the biblical definition of a church. That is the number of witnesses that are needed in the Old Testament to prosecute someone of a crime. And it's also the number of witnesses necessary in Matthew 18 to proceed forward with a case of church discipline against someone who is accused. So when they use that for the definition of church, my head explodes because I'm a nerd. Nonetheless, why would the church not want the children to participate, to grow as everyone else? The argument is something to the effect, Jesus rebuked the disciples for keeping children from him. Oh boy. Okay, that's a stretch. I mean, I'd pull a hamstring trying to get that far. The other side supports children's church, saying something to the effect that children's church is similar to Sunday school, offering a class for younger members during the sermon so that they too are being fed on their level. Question is, which way do we go? Okay, let me say this. We have no idea how the early church organized themselves and met. We do not know. In fact, I read the whole Bible. It's not in there. Early church history, there is no record in the first hundreds of years of the early church what a service even looked like. Were the kids in the room? Were they in another room? Did people stand up? Did people sit down? What was the order of service? How many songs were sung? We just don't know, because much of the early church met in homes. These were private gatherings, and oftentimes it was in a cultural context where Christianity was outlawed. You could be arrested. There was a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about Christianity. And so this tended to be more private gatherings, not public to the degree that we have them today. I mean, today we live stream our services on the internet, and in that day when it's illegal and you could get arrested or you could get harmed or you could even get strongly opposed publicly, you kind of kept that to yourself. Think more like churches meeting in a house church context in a closed communist country, and as a result, they're not broadcasting a lot of their details. So it's very hard to argue from this is how the early church was organized, because the truth is, we just don't know. We can speculate some things. We know that they sang songs. We know that the Bible was taught. We don't know what their order of service, or to use another word, what their liturgy was. That being said, there's a lot of things in the church today that we know for a fact were not in the early church. They didn't have sound systems. We do. They possibly didn't sit in seats. They certainly didn't have pews. We do. Usually the church didn't own a public building. They oftentimes met in homes. We own public buildings. They didn't drive cars. They didn't have parking lots. They didn't have electricity, and they didn't have men's and women's restrooms. So we could get rid of all of that and say we're just being biblical. Walk to church and hold it. I mean, we could say that, but I'm not sure that's the best course forward. So there are things that are closed-handed that we all need to agree on. There are things that are open-handed. What to do with kids in church, it really is an open-handed issue. And it can become closed-handed in both directions. Closed-handed where we don't do children's church and kids are in the service and all kids need to go to the service and mom's just supposed to be exhausted and try and duct tape the kids to the chair and keep handing them lollipops so they don't make noise so that we all pretend that her kids are Jesus and they never have problems. Or the opposite is where we have a closed-handed issue and kids are not allowed in the service because we don't want any noise and we don't want kids running around and we don't want kids disrupting the pastor. And you can get legalistic in both directions. We had one experience as a family. I've got 5 kids. They're older now. They're now 11, 13, 15, 17, and 19. And when they were younger, we went on vacation in Central Oregon. And at the time with us, he's now gone home to be with the Lord, was my father-in-law, who was a pastor for 40 some years. And I'm a pastor. So it's grandpa pastor and his raised in church kids and his son-in-law, who's a pastor, and his raised in church grandkids. So pretty much, we know how to go to church. This is what we've been doing since, I don't know, the 70s. And so we show up with our 5 kids and we sit down and an usher comes up and literally tells me and Grandpa Gibb, the children need to go to children's church. They're not allowed to be in the main service. And I looked at my kids and I said, well, do you guys want to stay in service? Do you want to go to kids' church? And they all said, we want to sit in the main service. Part of it was they were used to sitting in service. My kids chose to go to main service when they were little. For sure, they know how to sit through a sermon. If there's ever been a kid who knew how to sit through a very long sermon, it would be a Driscoll kid. I'm very long-winded. I feel like an hour is a good introduction to a sermon, and my kids grew up going to church all the time and listening to their dad over and over and over. So my kids are varsity sitting in church, absolutely ready for the all-star game of sitting in church. They have put in their innings. Nonetheless, this guy comes up and says, nope, they need to leave. I said, no, wait a minute. My kids want to sit in church. You know, they're highly trained professionals. They have sat in church. They can do this. He says, either they need to go to kids' church or they need to leave. And I look at my father. I said, I'm a pastor. He's a pastor. We've only got 5, 6 kids. I think one of the cousins was with us. If they get out of line, we got 2 pastors here. We'll handle them. Plus all the parents, and they literally said, you're going to need to leave. And I looked at Grandpa Gibby. He's like, we're out. So I got kicked out of church. Now, for some of you, that's not shocking. But the reason might be I got kicked out of church because I had kids that want to listen to the sermon. And so Grandpa Gibb and I got up, and the kids got up, and the family got up, and we all left. And we just were sort of dumbfounded, like we all just got kicked out of church. And the kids were sort of mystified, and I was kind of mortified. That's an example of a legalism. The Bible has principles that God's people should gather, that they should worship, that children should be raised in the training and admonition of the Lord. That's a principle. The methods can vary, and they do culturally, okay? And so the way I've always done it in the ministries that I've had the honor of leading, including here at the Trinity Church, we offer childcare now, 6 months to 6th grade. That can adjust in the future. The parents make the decision per child per year. Do you want them in kids ministry, age appropriate, give mom a break, or do you want them in the main service? And the truth is, we have families that they make different decisions based upon the attention span, the maturity, the capacity of the kid, what the demands and needs are for mom. If she's got a newborn and a toddler and an 8-year-old, she's just trying to get a little bit of break and enjoy God's word. I tend to be more about tools than rules, and I like relationships over lots of legalism. And so what I've always said is the parents are in the position to decide. We offer both, and we let the parents decide. That way, those who are really strong, my kids need to be in church, well, bring them in. No, my kids should go to an age-appropriate Sunday school class. Well, then let them go. And if anybody wants to fight over it, it's because they're trying to make a rule where God hasn't. And our only rule should be we don't make any extra rules. Thanks for the question, Pastor Mark out.